Well, here at the Fitzwilliam Museum we have quite a large collection of coffins that's been built up over a long period of time. We've been focusing on two particular coffins in our collection. These are actually sets of coffins. One belongs to a man called M.Mousa, dating to about 1000 BC, and the other is a set of coffins belonging to a man called Parkepu, and that dates to about 650 BC.
Yeah, that's fine.
We wanted to do things in a slightly different way to the way that coffins are normally studied. So we started to work in a very collaborative way. I'm an Egyptologist. I was looking at things very much from the Egyptological point of view, and my colleagues who are conservators were looking at things from the conservation point of view and the technology point of view.
So it's just very, very beautifully made.
Yeah. Studying the structure below the surfaces has involved CT scanning and X-rays, and that's been led very much by Julie Dawson and Jenny Marchant in collaboration with an expert in ancient carpentry, and that's Geoffrey Killen. He has replica tools, talks to us about techniques of woodworking. He also advises us about joints and things like that and why the Egyptians might have done things in particular ways. Nellie's been working on the pigments, and Elspeth has been working with her to actually use those pigments on replicas. So it's been actually a really good synergy between the two of them. We're lucky to have Melanie Pitkin join our team this year to work with me as an Egyptologist as well, to study in more detail the actual texts and images on the outside of the coffin and to look at them in a sort of more holistic way within Egyptological research. I just noticed these rather spectacular drips. Look there, that one's really long, that runs down there. But then it looks as if someone's wiped it up. Do you think?
Tried to clean it up, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's ancient or modern. We'll have to talk to Elspeth and see what she reckons about that. We get together quite regularly and sit down and study what we've been finding out about the coffins.
I mean, compared to something like Nestor, which is beautiful decoration and complete dog's breakfast inside.
Yeah. What's really exciting about that, though, not only is it saves a lot of time, it brings out whole new things. We sit down and say, no, that doesn't work, or, and then you suddenly have a kind of light bulb moment. You think, maybe it's for that reason. And then you go back and, you look together at these things and it comes out with amazing results, really. The coffins of Nestor are beautifully decorated, highly detailed, very well finished. The decoration on those two coffins of Parkepu is really substandard, using a very emotive term. That tells us quite a lot about the status of the two. So Nestor was somebody who worked at the premium temple of the day, which was the temple of Karnak, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, king of the gods. He was somebody fairly distinguished, could afford quite an expensive coffin. Parkepu, in contrast, was somebody who worked in the funerary industry. He was a man that you could employ to look after the cult of your dead relatives. So if you buried your father and then you were expected to go and pour water and recite rituals at the tomb very regularly, you didn't want to do that, you could employ Parkepu to go and do that for you. So his job title was water pourer on the west of Thebes.
Here we can actually see Parkepu as the deceased individual lying on a bier or a bed. He's wearing a long beard, which is to associate him with the god Osiris, so he's a divine being. And then we've got the jackal-headed god Anubis, and he's the god of mummification, with his arm, which is very unusually outstretched all the way across his body. And then underneath the bed we can see 4 vessels, which are most probably canopic jars used to store the internal organs of the deceased. So there are a number of scenes and inscriptions on Parkepu's coffins. The scenes are commonly invoking the gods and goddesses, but the inscriptions aren't always particularly legible, so the scribal hand on Parkepu's coffin set is quite sloppy.
The decoration on the outside of the inner coffin of Parkepu is really not great, as I've said. So we were expecting the internal structure of that coffin to be rather bodged together. We took it down to Addenbrooke's Hospital to CT scan it. It went through the scanner and we were all standing in the room looking at the monitor and staring at it, and then we all just looked at each other and going, it's so well made. It's so well made. We'd never seen a coffin so beautifully carpented. The face was beautiful, the joints were so tight, there were so few pieces of wood in it that we were just stunned. I mean, it must have been expensive.
So the wonderful thing about the CT scanning is that the X-ray source is going round and round the object, and that means that we are able then to see images from every direction. For us, when we're looking at those images, we look at the slices of film in 3 different directions. Look at that. You can start to really nice. Yeah, because we can start to see where they've actually put the paste layer, which has been pushed into the corner. Then, in fact, the textile layer is coming up over the surface. If I go there.
Julie's spent a lot of time really looking at the structure, particularly the wooden structure. I've been looking more at the layers over the top. So on the CTs, so that's partly the paste layers that we're seeing, and they show up as bright white areas. We're also sort of seeing where these sort of upper decorative layers, they're separating from the surface of the wooden carcass, and that's because of this textile layer in between.
So these dowels.
Yeah, these are the dowels coming through the end, and I think looking at, you can see the worm damage.
Oh,
see
yeah.
the wormholes there. If I make that a bit larger.
My role in this particular project has been looking at the scans that have been produced, and then from the scans working out drawings and then producing replicas of Pakepu and Nespereshefet, and these have been passed on to other specialists who have actually worked on them to put the varnish and paint layers on the surface. What I'm doing at the moment is preparing a mortise. There are mortises chopped in the rim of the bottom box and along the top edge of the lid. A mortise is chopped with a chisel across the grain. Into these 2 holes are fitted a piece of wood called a loose tenon. A loose tenon connects both the lid and the box together, and to secure them, holes are drilled through the mortise into which pegs fit, so the lid and the box are sealed. Unlike other coffins, such as Nespereshefet, which is made from a patchwork of wood, the Pakepu's coffin is made more or less entirely of solid planks of wood, apart from one piece with recycled wood. That tells us that the quality of wood being delivered to the workshops was better.
It's really raised a lot of questions for us. Was it that Pakepu's family decided to lash out and buy a really beautifully made coffin and then realised actually we haven't got enough money for the decoration? When it was excavated, around about 1869, it was broken open to examine it, and this was pretty normal at that time. The process of doing that broke through these structures that are overlaying the outside of this coffin. Now that may have been a protective layer over the outside. I'd like to think of it almost like an eggshell, because one of the Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and resurrection was about new life coming out of an eggshell. So a little bird would be hatched out of an egg and be reborn.
So the way this coffin is made, it's made of 2 halves with a lid and a bottom. Then the body is put in, coffin is closed, and it was then completely wrapped in linen. First, the white paste layers were applied on top of the linen. The painter would then start with marking out the design over the whole coffin. So we can see all these straight lines that have been applied with a pen and a straight edge, but also to mark out the whole scenes and the text on the coffin. But some areas were difficult to do, for instance the curve over the shoulder, and we can see there that those marking outlines didn't really join up because it was difficult to do with a straight edge and a pen. We see 2 yellows on this coffin, so we see the yellow ochre in all the stripes and underneath the text. But also ornament has been used, and we can see that in the background. It would have been really sparkly and bright yellow, but as it is light sensitive, it has faded over time. The way those colored paints were made is with minerals that are crushed up to make pigments. We end up with a yellow iron oxide powder, in this case yellow ochre. Ornament is very yellow, it's very beautiful, it's very sparkly. It has a completely different nature than yellow ochre, but it's also very, very toxic because it contains arsenic. The system with making charcoal into a paint is the same. It was just crushed up into a powder and then mixed with gum arabic to make into to a paint. So on coffins and also on the coffin of Pakepu, pens are used. It's just a hollow reed that works quite similar to present-day fountain pen. This is Egyptian blue. It is a man-made pigment, so the people made it themselves. And the reason for that is that blue is difficult to find, and the minerals that are blue are far too expensive to be used as a pigment. The Egyptian blue in this coffin has darkened, has blackened a little bit, which is a natural phenomenon of the Egyptian blue pigment. But it's still there everywhere, in his beard, the stripes in his wig, in the hatching on the breast, and in all the figures and over the whole decoration of his inner coffin. We're next to two reconstructions of sections of the lids of the inner coffins of Nespa and Pakepu. Jeff made the construction, sourced the wood and everything. I worked with the textile layers, the white paste layers and the paint layers. It's interesting that both coffins have received the same pigments, so to speak. There's no real difference in the type of pigments that have been used, but the way those pigments have been handled is completely different. The nice relief that we see on Nespa, for instance in the little wigs, all the little dots in the Egyptian blue, the relief in the feathers, all that is completely absent in Pakepu. This is flat. I need to collaborate with Nelly a lot because without a real insight of how the pigments differ per coffin or what the pigments actually are, I couldn't make the paints really.
With Pakepu, I started by taking a series of technical photographs, then followed this up with a series of non-invasive analytical techniques that we have available here at the Fitzwilliam. This includes FORS, which is fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, and that allows us to shine a light onto the surface of the coffin and we would observe the reflected spectrum back. And this tells us a lot about the surface of the object and what kind of pigments we would find there. We also have the use of X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, or XRF. It's entirely non-invasive and tells us about the chemical elements present in various pigments on the surface. One of our sampling techniques that we have available to us here is cross-section analysis. And in this, we would take a small half pinhead size sample of paint from the surface of the coffin, and then we would embed it in polyester resin. And before I mount it, I'm just checking to make sure that all the layers are there. And I'm just transferring it now to the polyester resin mold. And in it goes. And then when we grind through the polyester resin block, we get a perfect cross-section that shows us the layer structure. And this tells us an awful lot about how people would have applied the different paint layers onto the surface of the coffin. I'm just looking at the final cross-section down the microscope under high magnification. This one's turned out very well. I can see 3 distinct layers, which is showing us the construction of the coffin. I can see very clearly that there is a nice thick pinkish beige layer, and that is the pink paste that we know is applied to sort of smooth out the surface. And then this is followed with a nice thick white preparation layer. And then on top you can see this red paint layer, which I think is very likely to be red earth. But again, I won't know until I've taken some further samples. So yeah, I think that this has turned out very nicely. So these analytical methods tell us an awful lot about the materials, but also the methods. So how these materials were applied to the surface of the coffin, how they were painted, what they were painted with, and this can tell us how wealthy they were, where they were getting their materials from, what kind of conditions they were being painted in. All of this helps to paint a picture of the artisans and the workshops that were creating these coffins.
When you're working with a team of specialists, in many ways it's like working as it would have been worked in ancient Egypt. We have records in ancient Egypt to show painters and carpenters working as cooperatives.
Yeah. Unlike us today, I suspect that talking about death was absolutely natural because it was part of their lives, their daily lives. So it was a constant source of conversation. It was something that provided an industry, if you like. So it's economically quite important, the trade in death. If you could afford a good life with servants on earth, you could afford a good life in the afterlife by preparing and going and buying the things that they needed to have this good afterlife. Both the coffins in question have come to us as gifts to the museum, and that means they're taken away from their archaeological environment. We don't know exactly where they were found, and potentially that means that there is no kind of background story, if you like, to them. But by studying them closely, we can find actually there really is a background story. It might sound a bit wacky as an idea, but the Egyptians wanted to live forever, and one of the ways of doing that was to have their names said over and over again. And so, in effect, we are doing that. And bizarrely, by looking at their coffins, we are causing them to live forever. And I hope that they would be grateful to us for doing that.